All right, so I'm Jeff Bryan, the Executive Director and Co-founder at the Positivity Project, and thanks everyone for joining today. Mike is the author of Lead Yourself First, Inspiring Leadership Through Solitude, and today he's going to be talking about building and sustaining a positive organizational culture. We know this is so important, especially today with all the uncertainty about what's going to happen next year. We're reading the articles of what's happening in Europe and in Asia right now because they're a little bit ahead of this. We're also talking to schools, and we know that there's just a lot of uncertainty in terms of what next year is going to look like, in terms of jobs and a lot of other very real things. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike and let him share some of his thoughts on the way to move forward.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, just piggybacking on that comment, I think it's a really important one. We've certainly been hearing from a lot of educators across Michigan, New York, North Carolina, California, Texas, like people writing in, Virginia, talking about just the uncertainty. And, we talked about this several weeks ago. We talked about a VUCA environment, that volatile, uncertain, chaotic, and ambiguous world that we're living in. Not all that dissimilar to war. What people write about is the fog of war. There is so much uncertainty and so much chaos, and all you can do is make the best decisions that you possibly can in the moment based upon what you got. For your information, knowing that things might change, things might be a little bit different on the other side of that. So I want to share some things today with you about a topic that I've learned about. So like a little bit of backstory on this is that about 2 years ago, I did some leadership development work for the company Spartan Race. Spartan Race based out of Boston, Massachusetts, but they're a global company. They put on these mud race and tough competition, obstacle course races. And, so I did some work with them, and their director of HR there, a woman who had come from the UK and like an even larger company, shared this deck with me. And it was pretty important to have a deeper understanding of like how to help them think through and how to help anyone think through building a positive organizational culture. And by the way, we're going to talk about this through the lens of school. And we're going to talk about this through the lens of your school, but it also applies to our families, to our volunteer organizations that we're a part of. It applies to our day jobs, but also, to any different aspect of life, right? Like this is not just limited to the company that we work for or the organization or the school that we lead, right? So when you start thinking about, and you ask people well, what is organizational culture? And you have that kind of question sitting at the center of the table, and you get people's input and their take on what it is. You get a lot of different answers, you get a lot of different ideas, but they usually coalesce around this idea that it's the shared system of values and beliefs and assumptions that essentially dictate and influence how people within an organization behave. So if you think about it, even in an organization like the military or something like that, where there's these strict laws and strict rules on how you're supposed to act, there's still going to be a high variance in how people act, right? Because we're different. We have different backgrounds. We have different upbringings. And because of that, there's just going to be a big difference there. And so how do you think about this from an organizational standpoint? About how do you get people to act in a relatively consistent way that reflects the values of the organization, right? And so when you start thinking about, okay, well, what are all the things that shape organizational culture? It really, unfortunately, boils down to about everything, right? There's no it boils down to this and that. There's so many things that shape it and affect it, right? Like your mission statement, your vision for your school, your core values, how you manage people, how you recruit people and then hire them. What is that process like? How you communicate in an ongoing way with the people that you lead, or in your personal lives, the people that you love. Your attitude, right? The attitude that people bring to the table every day. Is it more of one of fear and anger or disgruntled? Or is it optimistic and positive? The relationships within an organization. And then lastly, leadership, right? Leadership has a huge impact on positive organizational culture. And Jeff, turned me on about 6 years ago, I think 7 years ago, a long time ago, to a book called The Talent Code by this author named Daniel Coyle. Well, he wrote another book called The Culture Code. It came out about 3 years ago, and he did a really deep dive, qualitative study of 10 organizations that have this incredible high performance culture that recruits, like that people fight to become a part of that organization, and really study them and says, like, what is it about them that allows them to be so successful, and to not just be successful like in 1 year, but to build a sustaining culture of excellence, right? Like, what is it about Disney World or Apple or, elite military units or Alabama football, the New England Patriots? Like, there's just certain organizations out there that year after year after year, when all their competitors, kind of do the cha-cha, right? They're going one step forward and then taking a little back, and then they go forward and back. Like, they're just constantly just getting better and better and better, and everything that they do just grows, and therefore they become a talent magnet, and they bring in better people. Right? It's this, Jim Collins would call it like the clicks on the flywheel. And so that's really what this book explores. And this is really interesting when you look at how the author defines positive organizational culture. Really, he says, like, organizational culture is the sets of living relationships that are working together towards a shared goal or purpose. So what does that mean? There's a couple of key words to focus in on here, right? Number one, it's sets, apostrophe, a plural, right? It's not like a set of, no, it's multiple sets of living relationships, right? That means they're not static. And anybody who thinks and reflects on the quality of the relationships in their lives knows that relationships are not static. They're dynamic. They are, they are changing. They're evolving. They are people are absolutely thinking about how does my relationship now with somebody else change, right, over time. So as you start thinking about this and you start really reflecting on, okay, so what are the obstacles to building a positive organizational culture? Again, building good relationships, within your organization, within your family, within whatever it might be. All right. Well, turns out there's a lot of them. There's a lot of things that get in the way. And again, if we were doing a Socratic seminar, I'd kind of ask you the questions and write them all down and kind of think about it. But there is just inherent friction that we have with people. We talk about this, going back to it again, focusing in on that word relationships. Why at the Positivity Project, right, is our mission to empower America's youth to build positive relationships? Because it's hard, right? On one hand, we know that relationships are the number one predictor and driver of life satisfaction, but if only it was so easy to just be good at building good relationships. It's hard, it's challenging. People have different opinions. They have different experiences. They have different worldviews. They have different things that they want to give their time and their energy to. So as you start thinking about this, people have got, there's different stakeholders within an organization. Some people want to evolve and innovate. Some people want to continue doing what they've done for so long. But when you start thinking about obstacles to building a positive organizational culture right now in May of 2020, right, by far, there's no greater obstacle to building that positive organizational culture than the virtual learning environment. Right? The remote work environment, everything from children, students trying to do work in this environment, to trying to interact with their parents, who may or may not be able to, we got a participant here coming up here. Sorry. Hang on one second. What do you got? This is Matthias here. Oh, all right. Good thing there's only 8 people or 9 people on live today. Hang on, bud. I'll get back to you in a little bit. So there's just a lot of challenges, that we have when building that positive organizational culture. And so, when you think about this, especially the distributed work environment, how do you build relationships and maintain relationships with people? It's tricky, right? It is especially tricky when there's all these different stressors and different pressors on people's plates. If you start to think about all the ways that, this costs an organization, there's actual financial costs, there's cost to morale, there's cost to retention of employees and personnel, there's cost to just overall how well you perform. If you don't have a strong organizational culture, it's really hard to perform at whatever your objective is, whatever your goals are, whether it's profits, whether it's how students are performing, academically, it's wins and losses, in a sports game, right? Whatever it might be, it is really hard to be good at and to accomplish your mission without at least a good organizational culture, right? And ultimately, those that perform at the highest level, they would really have, as Daniel Quill describes, an elite organizational culture. So there's lots of obstacles, to building this, and the cost is significant, right? If you don't have a good organizational culture. So ultimately, the big driving point from this is that if you want to have a positive organizational culture that is effective, right? If you just leave it to chance, I don't understand how like that's going to happen, right? Like you're just kind of saying, hey, like, well, we hope that, right, that things are going to go well. Like it generally just doesn't go like that. You have to have a strategy. You have to have a game plan with how you're going to build and sustain that positive organizational culture. This is almost in many ways no different, except that it's harder because it's sets of relationships than what we talk about in the P2 all the time, which is that if you want to be good at building relationships in your life, you have to have a game plan. You have to have a strategy to be able to do it. And if your hope is that like, well, we're just going to kind of figure it out, we're going to fumble our way through it, that might work for some people, but for most of us, it doesn't. We have to have a strategy. And in the P2, we talk about it all the time as, right, you have to know how to see the good in people. You have to have the, that other people matter mindset to see the good in people, to be able to know that like people, when they're struggling, they need your support, that when they're doing something well, they need to be celebrated, that you're present with people, all those kinds of components of the other people matter mindset, right? That is and then seeing the character strengths in yourself and in other people, that's all a part of our intentional strategy to help individuals get better at building positive relationships in their life. When you start to think about building a positive organizational culture, same thing applies. You've got to be intentional. You have to have a game plan and a strategy to be able to do it. So how do you do it? The research, going back to Spartan Race, she shared with me this 150-page document that really unpacks, right? Like, what is it that a positive organizational culture does? Like, what are components or tenets of it? And it starts off with one big idea that ultimately we have to start evolving the way we look at organizational culture from this company-centric model, like, hey, this is who we are, these are our core values, this is what we do, and start to evolve it into looking at it through the lens of the employee experience. In other words, like, how do the people who work for the organization feel about, right, the organization? Like, how are we talking to them? And that is the most effective way that you can start with, again, the right framework to then build that positive organizational culture. Okay, so there's a company that's been around for about 100 years now. They're based out of Salt Lake City called O.C. Tanner. They've done tens of millions of dollars worth of analysis and research and looked into and understanding organizational cultures and how to build positive ones, right? And so this, I'm going to share with you a summary of their report and some of the biggest takeaways that I think apply to all of us, and especially you right now in your schools. So what they came down to, and this is, by the way, they did quantitative analysis, they did tons of focus groups, tons of qualitative analysis. They did all kinds of ways to gather data and information to understand how to build a positive organizational culture. And what they found is, in the center there, you can see this, great culture is really defined by 6 different things. Success, opportunity, purpose, appreciation, well-being, and leadership. Right, and they basically unpack this in great detail. So what did they find? Right, they found that companies that performed well in these 6 areas were 4 times more likely to have highly engaged employees. Right, they were 4 times more likely. I don't have them, buddy. I'll have to get you some after this is over. Okay, can you wait for like 10 more minutes? Thank you. All right, I feel like the BBC interview guy here. You're 4 times more likely to have employees that are going to give like a positive net promoter score of like, yes, this is a good company, this is a good organization to be a part of. You're more likely to be successful, more profitable. Whatever your outcomes are, profits, test scores, wins and losses, bottom line, you're more likely to be successful at whatever that outcome is that you're driving towards. You are more likely to have like employees that are doing innovative and creative work. And then lastly, this all ties into success, right? You're just 11 times less likely to have had to lay somebody off or let somebody go, right? And now, to be clear, this tends to be focused a lot on the business world, but these ideas really apply across different sectors: military, sports, education, nonprofits, etc. So I just want to run through quickly these ideas. Number 1, purpose. Like, how do you connect people to a bigger sense of purpose in what they're doing? And especially in the world today, like, how do you remind people of that purpose, especially in this decentralized remote environment? I think most teachers, most educators saw that on a daily basis, right? Like they interact with a student or children, they saw that breakthrough moment, right? And they could experience it. They didn't need to be reminded of their purpose as much. I think it's especially important right now. Now, why am I showing you a picture of a janitor? You might have heard the story from when President John Kennedy visited Johnson Space Station down in Houston, Texas, and he ran into the janitor and he asked the janitor, what do you do here? And he says, I'm helping to put a man on the moon. You know, and like whether that's a folklore or that's real, like I believe it's real. I've read from enough different sort of sources and all that, but like the point is, it was that yes, he's actually cleaning the floors and scrubbing the toilets, but at the end of the day, that's not how this guy sees it, right? He saw his role as being an integral part to the bigger picture of helping to put somebody on the moon, right? And that's this idea of how do we relay a sense of purpose to the people that we lead. It's especially important today. When you connect the dots between individual roles and the goals of the organization, people see that connection and they get more energy out of their work. Number two, opportunity, right? Opportunity is typically kind of thought of as like promotion or a chance to take on a new task in a job. Really what the research shows here from all this is that it's really about empowering people, right? So you give them opportunities to do things that they maybe otherwise wouldn't get a chance to do. It gives them a chance to stretch themselves. And I will tell you, right, with great clarity, that most people right now are experiencing opportunity with a capital O. Perhaps they're experiencing too much opportunity right now in terms of like taking on new ways of doing things that they did not have training for or were not prepared for, right? But at the end of the day, when you give people that opportunity to grow and to build new skill sets, that's generally something that keeps them engaged within the organization, right? When you start talking now about success, right? So like this is an image of someone kind of giving somebody some feedback, right? In an evaluation report or in a progress review or whatever you want to call it. The research here was pretty fascinating, right? That the difference in perception of success when you apply these four things above is basically 4 to 5x, right? Basically, do people feel successful when they feel that they have the tools that they need, right? They're given a fair performance assessment. They know what they can do to achieve more within the organization, and they understand whether or not they're successful. We talked about this a little bit on the last Zoom when talking about like, look, part of the job is still to accomplish the mission. It's still to get the job done, right? The big one here is number one that we know right now, and that is like, do people feel that they have the tools that they need? And tools often means the training. And so this is a tough one right now when you're thinking about building a positive organizational culture. This is one that for anybody who's leading a school or leading a team, like this is a direct threat and a direct challenge to building positive organizational culture, because a lot of people that you lead do not necessarily feel that they have those tools that they need, right? So what do you do in a situation like that as a leader when people don't feel that they have the tools that they need to be successful? Well, like sometimes you can't just you can't rush the training and teach people like overnight how to get comfortable like teaching a lesson via Zoom, right? But certainly like you can help guide them, maybe give them some coaching, give them some feedback on how that lesson went. I'm in the Army Reserves and I'm a lieutenant colonel and I'm an assistant professor. I'm going to be teaching a class at West Point this summer virtually. And while I've done lots of things virtually before and I've taught this class in front of the classroom for about 1,300 hours since 2011. I'm going to get feedback and coaching on how to do that starting next week. Why? Because teaching this class virtually to 19-year-old cadets, right, is not something that I've done before. And so this is something that the leaders that I am working for at West Point are doing to help me, to be able to help me feel, feel prepared and to be able to feel successful, right? So I think it's an important thing to do as a leader is to be able to give people that feedback, and when they're not feeling successful in the job, to be able to have that conversation with them and help them walk through what is it that they can do differently or they can do better. Number 4, we've got a whole lot of control over this one. It's gratitude. Gratitude is obviously one of the 24 character strengths in positive psychology. We talk about how important it is. Of all 24 character strengths, it is the most highly correlated with well-being, right? Are you seeing and acknowledging and recognizing the blessings you have in your life? And then are you saying or communicating or doing something about it to let other people know that, right? This here is a bit of the not positive side here, but when leaders do not effectively, communicate accomplishments, or they don't express this gratitude to the people that they lead, right? People are 70% less likely to feel appreciated. They're less likely to be engaged in the job. They're less likely to tell other people about your organization or about your school, right? Gratitude really, really does matter. Okay. And when people say the opposite, right? When they say, no, my manager or my principal or my leader, my manager, my boss, right, is acknowledging the good work that I'm doing and they're praising me for that, right? People are just more likely to stay. They're more likely to be engaged in their job. They're more likely to be able to persevere through the ups and the downs because they're feeling that sense of gratitude and appreciation. right? And oh, by the way, you can take a look at this here, but like, we're not talking like that you need to do big things. When it comes to gratitude, simple things like uttering the words, thank you, or you did a great job there, or a simple note. You know, I gave a speech to one of my friends. Their kids, like, they're not graduating, you know, not having the ceremony. So they asked, can I come in and do like a 5-minute talk on Zoom for their family, like little family graduation? And I got a thank you note from all 3 of the kids. Right, one was graduating a college program, one was graduating high school, one was leaving 8th grade and going into 9th grade. And it was like just that simple note that came in the card, that came in the mail, was so powerful to be able to read that and say, you know what, they really appreciated me taking 5 minutes out of my day to be able to just share a few thoughts with them. Right? By the way, I talked about the other people matter mindset. So as you might figure. But you can see people, it really matters that when they're recognized either formally or informally, it has a huge impact, right, on the overall organizational culture. We talked about this one for a couple of the last sessions, and that's well-being. So how do you think about the overall well-being of your staff, of your teachers? And this was one that we've centered a lot of our discussion around. Well, how do you help people put up boundaries to know when to work and when to stop, right? When to be present with their family and when to be, engaged, preparing, doing lesson plans, or going back and forth with your students, or teaching a class, or grading an assessment. This is really a holistic picture of health and well-being, right? It's being active, it's getting outside, getting into the sun, it's moving your body, right? It's this idea of, are we connecting with one another? So there's a whole bunch of different elements that are nested within this concept of wellness. And it's something that as leaders, if we want to build a positive organizational culture, we have to be looking out for the well-being of the people that we lead. Right. And so just as a quick example, like Tiffany on our team here, right, going to give her a big shout out, right? This is Mother's Day weekend, this past weekend. She's like, hey, I didn't respond to my emails, this weekend. I really was kind of putting the work down and, being present and appreciating Mother's Day. And now my batteries are charged and I'm back. I'm ready, and that's the whole idea, right? Did you just raise the roof? Wow. That's been a while since I've seen someone raise the roof. But that's the whole idea, right? You've got to be able to hopefully know yourself, but as a leader, you got to know the people around you. And when you can sense they're a little bit more on edge, you can sense they're getting a little bit burned out, right? Like to be able to say, hey, look, please just put it down. Like just honestly, don't check your email, tonight at 6 o'clock on, just check it tomorrow. Like just leave it alone. And hopefully we know ourselves that way, but as leaders, it's our responsibility to help the people that we lead to be able to see this and to recognize this and to have the permission to be able to put it down for a period of time as well. Right? There might be a short-term cost. Maybe you don't get your email answered right away, but guess what? You're going to have people that are more energized and more ready the next day or later on in the week because they're taking care of themselves, right? And again, this idea of well-being comes from one place only, a positive culture. The last one to talk about, and that is this concept of, we talked a lot about in the previous Zooms about leading yourself first, and leadership is a relationship, and how do we build relationships with people in this virtual and remote environment. I love this quote from Simon Sinek. A lot of you probably heard of him before, but the author of It Starts With Why, and he gave this really famous TED talk about the same thing here. But the leaders who get the most out of their people are the leaders who care the most about their people. Like this is so profoundly deep that it's unbelievable. When you start thinking about this, as I can see him pop up, he's like a little whack-a-mole. But you can think about this, that it is hard to be able to care for people, because why? It takes time, it takes energy, it takes all kinds of things. And when you think about leaders, right, and your role as a leader, if you're a principal, you got all these teachers and all the staff members that work for you, like you've got to think about how do you care about okay, you can just stay there for the rest of it, all right? You can just think about how do you help them to care, and to be able to show that. This is not as easy as it sounds, right? People need to know that you care about them, and how do you do it? How you communicate with them, how you talk to them, and how you treat them, right? And ultimately, I'll wrap up with this one quick thought, right? And that is that leaders are ultimately the ones that are responsible for bringing those other 5 factors together, right? So if you're a principal, you're assistant superintendent, you're, in your case for teachers out there, you're teaching not just your children in your class and your students, but also in some way an extension of them to their families, right? Leaders are the ones that are ultimately responsible for bringing those things together. So if you're a teacher, thinking about how you express gratitude, how you give that opportunity to your students to take on more, to do more, right? how you communicate and care about their overall wellness and their well-being. Those kinds of things matter. And they especially matter, if you're in that administrative role and you're thinking about this with your teachers. How do you help them to not burn out? How do you help them, to be able to sustain themselves for the long term? So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen here because I've got Matthias, by the way, for those who are not tracking, this was not planned. Some people might think this is a staged event. It was not. I'm not sure why he's not outside. But, at the end of the day, when we're talking about positive organizational culture, the final thing I'll conclude with here before turning it over to anyone who has any additional thoughts or questions is that this is challenging right now. To be able to build and to be able to sustain, and maybe you had a really strong positive organizational culture in your building, right? And then this hit. To be able to sustain it, very, very difficult. This goes back to this idea of giving yourself some grace. But those are some of the key things I hope that you reflect on and think about, right? That you can do in the weeks ahead to be able to hold on to the positive elements of your school's culture, because it's obviously more critical than ever that we think and we're as intentional as we can be right now about what we're doing to look out for the overall well-being of everybody in the ecosystem of the education environment right now. So with that, I'll turn it to you, Jeff, for thoughts. I need to turn it over to everybody for thoughts or feedback or questions you may have.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions? I know some people wrote in, so feel free to unmute and ask any questions.
Yeah, Jeff and Mike, you both can respond to this. Jonathan here from Michigan, and pardon my squinting in my background, but I dragged my kids outside and I don't want you to see my messy garage. So, so just like every other state, we're facing, drastic budget cuts, and, people are smart and they recognize that, not everybody's going to make it through this, and the fall is going to look dramatically different, both in how we deliver instruction and, how many people we have on board. So how do we maintain, anything good that we have going right now with, just this looming layoff potential on a pretty grand scale? I see Melissa's on there, and some stuff came out yesterday that, potentially 2,000 per pupil funding cut, which is outrageous. What are some thoughts on just how to maintain anything good we got going on right now with that looming in the background?
Yeah, so I'll share a few thoughts, and Jeff can kind of chime in. But number one, I would say, Jonathan, that first of all, this is Jim Collins' sort of 101 thing of the confront the brutal facts, but remain optimistic in the face of it. There is, like you said, a lot of uncertainty, and what is certain, in all that is that things are going to look different come the fall, and honestly, probably from here forward, right? This gets into just the complexity of all this. I would say that first and foremost, and there was a great piece today talking about the CEO of Airbnb, who actually Jeff grew up in the same town as Brian Chesky, talked about the way that he let go 25% of his staff. Right, talked about this idea of how he did it. Maybe we can share that article, Jeff. I think it was on LinkedIn today, or it was on Medium. But it's this idea of letting people know first and foremost, this is not your fault. This is not you. This is, things outside of the control. And then letting people know, hey, we're doing everything we can to be able to support you, right, in this. I would say, Jonathan, as well, depending on the tenure and how long people have been at your school or at whatever the school might be, is it's the power of, again, going back to relationships. We talk about this being key all the time, right? That relationships are, so critical to being resilient, right? And that we're there for people. And when people have had a tragedy in their life, they've lost somebody, or, something tragic, disastrous like this happens, and a bunch of people are let go or laid off, because this happens in sort of a lot of the corporate side of America frequently. And, even when I got back to Team Red, White, and Blue back in November, we had to let, basically a third of our staff go, because due to budget constraints and all that, and it's really hard to have those conversations. One of the longest days of my life was when I had those Zooms with 9 different members of our staff, but it was that message of this is really hard to be able to do. So I think how the news is delivered, is really important. I think on the front end of just being transparent with people to say, look, we know that there's things that we don't know yet. We all have to be prepared that that any one of us could not be here next year. So I think it's just being transparent with people and letting them know that they should be considering other, potential opportunities. That's not I don't think a negative way to approach it. In fact, when you study optimism, one of the things that optimists do really well, right, is that they they prepare for worst case scenario and they prepare for that. So I think that, it's looking out for people, letting them know of like, hey, you should be considering other employment routes, right? Because there are companies that are hiring. They may not be the ones that you want to go work for or whatever it might be, but to be able to make ends meet, right? There are certain companies that are hiring, right? And if we get through this, then perhaps there's an opportunity, right, in the future for people who have been, educators to come back into it, or maybe there's a substitute teaching, opportunities in the future. But it is trying to, not to be too cliche, but trying to help to find that silver lining, in the clouds for people, because I believe that's one of a leader's most important jobs in the time of adversity, is to help them to maintain hope and to not lose sight of the fact that, right, it's really bad right now, and it might even it might get worse in terms of the next school year, and you might not be, have a job here. Right, but we're going to stick together. We're going to help you out, and we're going to help you to be able to pull through this and ensure that you can take care of yourself and your family. So, Jeff, I don't know if you have any thoughts to add to that.
I think that really, I think everything Mike said, I agree with, and I think transparency and honesty is really important. And in anything, setting expectations. I know for me personally, like just knowing what to expect is always easier than not knowing. So if you know anything and you can share stuff, and like Mike said, start preparing people for a worst case scenario, while also like not losing the fact that you're doing everything you can to help them. But I mean, a lot of things just, worldwide are out of our hands right now. Like the economies are shutting down in a lot of places, and we're doing everything we can to support you. And I think that's it. We're all kind of in this together. But I think, like Mike said, the transparency and the honesty is probably the best place to start, in my opinion.
Yeah, I just would add one more thing to that, Jonathan. I'd say that, part of this is, that when you do that for people, so I've said this before to anybody who's ever worked, for me, like on my staff, of like, please don't be like think that, that I'm concerned about, like, if you're thinking about a job somewhere else, let me know, like, because like, I want to know that, right? Like, what that does is that engenders a sense of trust and loyalty with people, to know that, like, hey, no, if like I'm looking for somewhere else, then Mike wants to be able to support that. I think that what you do by signaling that message to people, like, and maybe it's not everyone, maybe there's a certain sector of your teachers or staff that are the most at risk. And I don't know how it works in different states, right? But based upon how much right, your tenure, maybe for teachers who've been there for 2 years or less, they're the first ones, to be let go, right? Or maybe it's, specials, right? Or, whatever it might be. But I think that whoever the highest at, risk population of your staff is, I think that's where you have that conversation. And oh, by the way, like by you telling them, like, hey, I want you actively out there thinking about and searching for something else other than this. Like, that shows that you care about them more than just the role that they're fulfilling for you, right, in your school, right? They're not just an ends to a means to an end for you, but you actually care about them as people. That signals something pretty powerful to them, that you really care about them as a human being.
Thanks, gentlemen.
Absolutely. Anyone else?
My wife, by the way, my wife just texted me, I can't find Matthias anywhere. Gee, wonder where he is. He's here with me. Goodness gracious. Other questions? All right. Well, maybe I'll just kind of wrap here in this crazy little Zoom session today. It was interrupted 4 times by my 4-year-old. So first of all, this is like, again, this is really just classic, in terms of like the world today, right? Like, I go back to the BBC, if you've seen the interview of the guy who given like this live interview on BBC, the kid comes in, this is not that, right? But this is a recording that maybe, 100 other people will see and maybe get a chuckle out of. But like, this is just totally reflective of the state of the world today. And I was talking to my brother about this the other day. He's like, how do you do it during the day? You do work, and like, I'm like, yeah, I usually go upstairs, and people know that I go upstairs to not come up there. And he goes, yeah, it feels like, if they hear kids in the background, it feels unprofessional. I said, no, man, the world, that ship has sailed. People understand, like, this is where we're at today. And sometimes you have kids, coming into your Zoom calls and yelling in the background, or they bang their head and they need attention at the time. And, I think that it's again, one of the things that's emerging from this whole crisis has been this idea of like not having to pretend that we've got it all put it together all the time, and just realizing the ups and the downs, of the challenges of leadership and of working from home, especially. So maybe there's some sort of like little lesson to be taken from that, here in Matthias deciding to interrupt us today. But with that being said, I'll conclude just by saying thanks a lot for your time. Whether you watched this live or watched it later, again, big thing, just putting a bow on it when it comes to positive organizational culture, right? It's hard, right? And it's especially hard today. And so be thinking about looking at those 6 factors. And of all the 6 ones, if I were to give you one to hone in on, focus on gratitude. Right? Express the gratitude to the people on your teams, to the people that work for you, to your staff, to your peers, to your colleagues, right? Thank them for leaning in, right? For being in the arena and getting stomped by the bull right now. It's not easy, but expressing that gratitude and on a consistent basis, not so that it gets inauthentic, right? But authentically consistent gratitude on that daily basis for being in this fight with you is arguably the very best thing that you can do. So, Jeff, any parting thoughts, and otherwise close it out?
No, that was great. Thank you, guys. Mike, awesome job. Thanks, everyone.
All right.